The morning of August 7th, 1943, dawned hot over Guadalcanal. Staff Sergeant Robert Chen of the Quartermaster Corps stood in what should have been a warehouse, but was instead an open-air graveyard of American abundance. Around him, stacked in the equatorial sun without shelter, sat tens of thousands of tin cans. They had travelled 6,000 miles from California canneries, survived submarine-infested waters, and arrived intact at this forward supply dump in the Solomon Islands. Now they were useless. The tropical heat had caused the tin to corrode, the seams to rupture, and the contents to spoil. Chen picked up one can. The label had dissolved into pulp. He could not tell if it had once contained peaches or pork. It did not matter. The smell told him everything. 50 yards away, soldiers from the 1st Marine Division queued for their midday meal, each man receiving a single K-ration that would leave him hungry. They could see the mountains of canned goods. They could smell the waste. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This was not an isolated incident. This was not the result of enemy action. This was the mathematics of American logistics encountering the reality of the Pacific theater, and it was happening on a scale that threatened the entire island-hopping campaign. At forward supply dumps across New Caledonia, in the New Hebrides, throughout the Solomon Islands chain, American food was rotting faster than American soldiers could eat it. Some observers at the time estimated that 40% of all rations shipped to the Southwest Pacific were spoiling before they reached a single mess kit. 40%, not lost to submarine attack, not destroyed by Japanese artillery. Simply wasted. In late 1943, one quartermaster officer inspecting a dump in New Caledonia reported seeing what amounted to entire priceless tarv, shiploads of supplies rendered useless, including over 100,000 cans of spoiled products in a single location. The United States was shipping more food across the Pacific than any nation had ever moved in the history of warfare, and nearly half of it was being thrown away. The men who saw this waste firsthand understood its cruelty in ways that statistics could not capture. They had watched friends weaken from malnutrition. They had seen tropical diseases take hold in bodies depleted by inadequate rations. They knew that back home, American families were living under rationing, carefully counting their red stamps for meat and their blue stamps for canned goods, making every ounce count. And here, in the forward areas where that sacrifice was supposed to matter most, American food was rotting in vast, stinking piles. The irony was almost unbearable. The nation with the greatest industrial capacity on Earth, the breadbasket that was feeding not only its own military but much of the Allied cause, could not keep its soldiers fed in the Pacific, not because there was too little food, but because there was too much waste. To understand how this catastrophe emerged, one must first understand what the Pacific War demanded of American logistics. The Quartermaster Corps had cut its teeth, supplying armies in Europe during the First World War. That experience had taught them how to move vast quantities of material across the Atlantic. The voyage from New York to Liverpool took 55 to 60 days. Supply lines stretched roughly 3,000 miles. Warehouses in Britain and France provided shelter for stored goods. The infrastructure of roads, railways, and ports, though damaged by war, still existed. The Pacific presented an entirely different problem. From San Francisco to Brisbane, where most Southwest Pacific supplies were routed, the distance was 6,200 miles. The voyage took not 2 months, but 4 to 5 months. When supplies needed to move, from point to point within the theatre itself, distances could extend to 8,000 miles. And at the end of these journeys, there were no warehouses, there were no roads, there were, in most cases, no ports. There were coral beaches, dense jungle, and forward supply dumps that consisted of whatever shelter could be improvised from local materials or fabricated from tarpaulins. The supply system operated on a principle of abundance. In the chaos following Pearl Harbor, as the military expanded at unprecedented speed, the approach was to push supplies forward without waiting for requisitions. Better too much than too little. The assumption seemed sound enough. It took months for supplies to cross the Pacific. If units in forward areas had to submit requests and wait for those requests to be filled, they would starve before the system could respond. So the Quartermaster Corps simply sent everything in quantities calculated to be more than adequate. The mathematics said it should work. Each soldier required approximately 6¼ pounds of rations and consumables per day. Multiply that by the number of men, factor in the distances, and ship accordingly. But mathematics did not account for what happened when those supplies finally arrived. The food came in tin cans. This was the backbone of American field rations in the Pacific. Canned meat, canned vegetables, canned fruit. The C ration that formed the basis of combat feeding consisted of 12-ounce cans, 6 per man per day. The D ration emergency chocolate came in tins. Even the K ration, designed to be lightweight, contained small canned components. Tin was ideal for many reasons. It resisted temperature fluctuations during the long ocean voyage. It protected contents from contamination. It could be mass-produced by American industry at the scale required. But tin had one crucial weakness. It could not withstand prolonged exposure to the tropical environment of the Pacific. The heat was relentless, often exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit in supply dumps with no shade. The humidity approached saturation. Salt spray from the ocean corroded metal, and time, measured in the months it took for supplies to travel from California to forward areas and then sit awaiting distribution, gave these forces ample opportunity to work. The cans began to fail. Rust formed at the seams. The protective lacquer finish degraded under constant exposure to heat and moisture. Punctures occurred during the rough handling inherent to combat logistics, where supplies were slung into cargo holds, dropped onto beaches during amphibious assaults, and shoved off the backs of trucks on makeshift jungle roads. Once a can's integrity was compromised, the contents spoiled rapidly in the tropical heat, and because labels were printed on paper, they dissolved or wore away, leaving quartermasters unable to identify what was in damaged containers, even when the cans themselves remained intact. The result was waste on a scale that defied comprehension. In some forward areas, supply officers reported cycles of feast and famine. A massive shipment would arrive, more food than the local units could possibly consume before spoilage set in. Men would eat well for a period. Then, as the supplies degraded faster than they could be distributed, rations would dwindle. Then another shipment would arrive, and the cycle would repeat. The system was generating abundance and scarcity simultaneously. This was the situation that confronted the Quartermaster Corps in the summer and fall of 1943. The island-hopping campaign was accelerating. More men were being pushed forward. The distances were growing, and the waste was threatening to become a strategic liability. If 40% of rations were being lost, that meant the supply chain needed to move 40% more than necessary, consuming shipping space desperately needed for ammunition, fuel, and other war materials. It meant longer voyages, more ships at risk from submarines, more strain on port facilities already operating beyond capacity. The mathematics of abundance had collided with the reality of tropical warfare, and something had to change. The question facing the Corps was not whether to act, but what could possibly be done to salvage a system breaking under the weight of its own success. The belief system that produced the waste crisis was not born of incompetence. It emerged from hard-won lessons and the particular geography of 20th century American power. To understand why tens of thousands of tons of food were rotting on Pacific beaches in 1943, one must understand what the United States Army had learned about feeding soldiers in the previous war, and what it had failed to learn about the limits of that knowledge. The modern American military supply system had its origins in the mobilization for the First World War. When the United States entered that conflict in April 1917, the Army numbered approximately 130,000 men. Within 18 months, it would grow to over 4 million. This explosive expansion created immediate logistical challenges. The Quartermaster Corps, responsible for feeding this force, had to industrialize military subsistence almost overnight. They turned to the American food industry, which was itself undergoing transformation. The early 20th century had seen dramatic advances in food preservation. Canning technology had matured, refrigeration was becoming widespread. The science of nutrition was emerging, allowing planners to calculate caloric and vitamin requirements with unprecedented precision. The Quartermaster Corps embraced these innovations and created a supply system built on industrial abundance and scientific management. The lessons from that war seemed clear. Large-scale canning worked. Mass production could meet military needs. The supply system should push food forward aggressively because the cost of shortage far exceeded the cost of surplus. These principles were codified in Army regulations and became the foundation for interwar planning. When the Second World War began, the Quartermaster Corps scaled up the same approach. They contracted with American canneries to produce rations on an even greater scale. They calculated requirements based on the number of men multiplied by daily caloric needs. They implemented a push system where supplies moved forward without waiting for requisitions. The model had worked in the First World War, moving supplies 3,000 miles to France. It should work again. But the Pacific War was not the Western Front. The geography alone presented challenges that had no precedent in American military experience. The Pacific Theater was not a theater in the conventional sense. It was an ocean covering 64 million square miles, dotted with thousands of islands, most of them lacking any infrastructure whatsoever. The distance from the West Coast supply bases to forward areas in the Southwest Pacific was more than twice the distance across the Atlantic. And once supplies reached the theater, they faced an additional problem. In Europe, even during wartime, there were warehouses. There were roads connecting supply depots to combat units. There were buildings, railways, established ports. In the Pacific, outside of a few major bases in Australia, New Zealand, and Hawaii, there was nothing. Supply dumps were established on islands that had been uninhabited jungle weeks or days before. Warehousing consisted of whatever could be improvised with tarpaulins and poles, creating what quartermasters called paulin oases, or constructed using local materials like the thatched roof structures modelled on native buildings. These provided minimal protection from the elements. The environmental conditions exceeded anything the Quartermaster Corps had planned for. Temperature and humidity levels that would have been considered extreme in the continental United States were routine in the South Pacific. Rainfall could be torrential. Sunlight was intense. Insects were everywhere, boring through wooden crates and cardboard packaging. Salt air corroded metal. Mold and mildew grew on virtually everything. And time, the great enemy of all preserved food, had far longer to work in the Pacific than it ever had in Europe. The lengthy supply lines meant rations spent months in transit before reaching forward areas. Once there, they might sit for additional weeks or months before being distributed to combat units. This extended exposure gave the tropical environment ample opportunity to degrade packaging, compromise seals, and spoil contents. The canning technology that had seemed so reliable was, in fact, optimized for temperate climates and shorter supply chains. The tin cans used for sea rations and other field rations had been designed based on domestic commercial standards. They performed adequately in warehouses in the United States or in the moderate climate of Western Europe. They failed in the Pacific. The problem was not the food inside the cans, which had been properly processed and sealed. The problem was that the cans themselves could not maintain their integrity under sustained tropical conditions. The lacquer coating that protected the tin from rust was not formulated for extreme heat and humidity. The seams where the can components were joined became weak points where corrosion could penetrate, and once water or air entered a can, spoilage followed rapidly in the tropical heat. The packaging compounded the problem. Cans were packed in wooden crates or cardboard boxes for shipment. These containers were adequate for domestic commerce or for the relatively short supply lines in Europe. They deteriorated quickly in the Pacific. Wood absorbed moisture and warped. Cardboard disintegrated in the humidity. Labels printed on paper dissolved or wore away, leaving quartermasters unable to identify contents. Even when the cans themselves remained intact, the outer packaging often failed, leaving supplies exposed to the elements. The rough handling inherent to combat operations accelerated the degradation. Supplies were loaded and unloaded repeatedly during their journey across the Pacific. They were slung into cargo holds with little regard for careful placement. During amphibious assaults, they were dropped onto beaches from landing craft. On makeshift roads through jungle terrain, they were bounced and jolted in trucks lacking suspension. Every impact was an opportunity for packaging to fail, for cans to puncture, for seals to compromise. The belief that drove the system, the conviction that abundance would overcome all obstacles, was itself an artifact of American industrial capacity. The United States had the productive power to manufacture enormous quantities of canned rations. It had the merchant marine to ship them across vast distances. The assumption was that if enough supplies were pushed forward, some adequate quantity would survive the journey and reach the soldiers who needed them. This was economics rather than logistics. It treated waste as an acceptable cost of ensuring that frontline troops never went hungry. But the scale of waste in the Pacific was exceeding the margins the system could absorb. When 40% of rations were spoiling, it meant the supply chain needed to move 67% more food than soldiers actually consumed. That additional burden fell on shipping, which was a finite and desperately scarce resource. Every ship carrying extra rations to compensate for waste was a ship that could not carry ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, or replacement equipment. The human cost of this waste was immediate and visible to the men in forward areas. They saw mountains of rotting food while eating K-rations that left them perpetually hungry. They watched their bodies weaken from inadequate nutrition while, knowing that plenty existed, just out of reach behind the barrier of spoilage. The K-ration, designed as a short-term assault ration for paratroopers, was being issued for weeks or months at a time because it was lightweight and compact. It provided 2,800 calories per day, barely adequate for men engaged in combat operations in tropical conditions. The packaging for K-rations was better than that of C-rations, using waxed cardboard that resisted moisture, but the ration itself was nutritionally marginal for sustained use. Men on extended K-ration diets, such as those in Merrill's Marauders or the British Chindit forces in Burma, experienced severe weight loss, averaging 35 pounds per man over the course of several months. Vitamin deficiencies led to diseases like pellagra and beriberi. These were preventable conditions, the result not of scarcity, but of a supply system that could not bridge the gap between abundance at the source and adequate nutrition at the front. The doctrine that had seemed so sound in planning was proving inadequate in execution. The Quartermaster Corps had calculated requirements scientifically. They had mobilized industrial capacity on an unprecedented scale. They had implemented a push system designed to prevent shortages. And in the Pacific, it was all failing because the environment and the distances exceeded the tolerances built into the system. The waste was not a minor inefficiency to be corrected with better management. It was a fundamental mismatch between the supply system's design parameters and the operational reality of the Pacific War. Something would need to change, not at the margins but at the core. The question was what, and whether it could be changed quickly enough to sustain the accelerating pace of the island-hopping campaign that was pushing American forces deeper into the Pacific. The Quartermaster Subsistence Research and Development Laboratory in Chicago became the center of the American effort to salvage the Pacific supply system. Established in 1936, the laboratory had been responsible for developing the C-ration, the K-ration, and the D-ration chocolate bar. Its staff included chemists, nutritionists, bacteriologists, and food technologists, drawn from universities and the commercial food industry. By late 1943, they faced a problem that threatened to undermine everything they had accomplished. The rations they had designed were nutritionally sound and could be mass-produced at scale, but they could not survive the journey to the soldiers who needed them. The laboratory began receiving detailed field reports from quartermaster officers throughout the Pacific Theater. These reports painted a consistent and troubling picture. In New Caledonia, summer 1943, inspectors found over 100,000 cans of spoiled products in a single dump. The cans had corroded through at the seams. The contents were putrid. In the Solomon Islands, entire shipments of C-rations were being condemned upon arrival because the wooden crates had disintegrated during the ocean voyage, leaving the cans exposed to salt spray and rough handling. At forward supply dumps on Guadalcanal and New Georgia, quartermasters reported that they could not identify the contents of cans because the paper labels had dissolved. Without labels, they could not properly distribute rations or manage inventory. Supplies sat unused until they spoiled, at which point they were dumped into waste pits or buried. The statistics arriving from the field confirmed what individual reports suggested. Food losses in the Southwest Pacific were running between 30 and 40% of total supplies shipped. This figure represented not just the value of the wasted food itself, but the compound cost of shipping it across thousands of miles of ocean, the burden on port facilities to handle it, the labor required to move it from ships to dumps to disposal sites. The military was operating a supply system where nearly half the output was waste. The laboratory staff understood that this was unsustainable. The island-hopping campaign was accelerating. The plans for 1944 called for major operations in the Marshall Islands, the Marianas, and eventually the Philippines. Each advance would push supply lines further from their sources. If waste continued at current rates, the logistics would collapse under their own weight. The technical challenge was formidable. The laboratory needed to develop packaging that could withstand months of exposure to tropical heat, humidity, salt air, and rough handling, while still being economically feasible to produce at the scale required. Commercial packaging standards were inadequate. The tin cans used for sea rations were based on peacetime domestic commerce, where products moved from factory to store to consumer in a matter of weeks and were stored in climate-controlled environments. Military rations in the Pacific faced an entirely different environment. They spent 4 to 5 months in ship holds crossing the ocean. They were stored in open-air dumps where temperatures could exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit and humidity approached saturation. They were exposed to salt spray during amphibious landings. They were subjected to impacts and vibrations during transport over primitive roads. The packaging needed to maintain integrity through all of this, or the most carefully formulated ration in the world would spoil before a soldier could eat it. The laboratory began working with private manufacturers to develop improved packaging materials. The critical breakthrough came with the development of what became known as the V-box. Traditional wooden crates were heavy, absorbed moisture, and warped in tropical conditions. Cardboard boxes disintegrated. The V-box used a combination of fiber and sisal, materials that provided strength while resisting moisture penetration. The boxes were treated with asphalt impregnation to further enhance water resistance. They were not perfect, they did not stack as efficiently as wooden crates, and they were not entirely moisture-proof, but they were significantly more durable than existing packaging, easier to handle, and saved space in the constrained cargo holds of transport ships. Parallel efforts focused on improving the cans themselves. The laboratory worked with tin manufacturers to develop more resilient lacquer coatings that could withstand tropical conditions. They modified seam construction to reduce weak points where corrosion could penetrate. They improved the methods for marking cans so that identification information could survive even when paper labels dissolved. The new cans used embossed or stamped markings directly on the metal, ensuring that quartermasters could identify contents regardless of environmental damage. These modifications required retooling production lines and retraining workers in canneries across the United States. The changes had to be implemented while maintaining production volume, because the military could not afford any interruption in the flow of rations to forces already engaged in combat operations across the Pacific. By mid-1944, the combination of improved packaging, revised distribution procedures, and field-expedient storage solutions began producing measurable results. Waste rates in the Southwest Pacific declined to approximately 13 to 14% by late 1944, down from the 40% observed a year earlier. This represented a dramatic improvement, though it still meant that more than 1 can in 8 was spoiling before consumption. But the 13% waste rate was comparable to the 9.5% waste rate observed in European operations, where conditions were far more favorable. The Pacific logistics system was approaching the limits of what could be achieved given the distances involved and the environment. The remaining waste was increasingly accepted as an unavoidable cost of operating at such extreme range in such hostile conditions. The human impact of these improvements was immediate and measurable in forward areas. Units that had been cycling between feast and famine as massive shipments arrived and then spoiled were now receiving more consistent supplies. The frequency of extended K-ration diets declined as sea rations became more reliably available. Medical officers reported fewer cases of vitamin deficiency diseases and less severe weight loss among troops in combat zones. The psychological effect was perhaps as important as the nutritional one. Soldiers could see that the waste was declining, that the system was becoming more efficient, that their sacrifice and that of families back home was translating into actual sustenance rather than rotting in dumps. The visible improvement in supply management reinforced confidence in the larger campaign as American forces pushed deeper into the Pacific through 1944 and into 1945. The reduction in waste from 40% to 13% represented more than an accounting victory. It meant that the supply chain carrying American forces across the Pacific could sustain deeper penetrations, longer campaigns, and larger concentrations of troops than had been possible in 1943. The practical effect was to extend the operational range of American forces by what quartermasters estimated at several hundred miles. This was not because ships could suddenly travel further or because new ports materialized in the Central Pacific. It was because the same shipping capacity, freed from the burden of compensating for massive waste, could now deliver effective supply to forces operating at greater distances from their bases. The invasion of the Philippines in October 1944 demonstrated the cumulative impact of these improvements. The operation required supplying over 200,000 troops across supply lines, stretching more than 6,000 miles from the west coast. The scale dwarfed anything attempted earlier in the Pacific campaign. Quartermaster planning for the operation assumed waste rates in the 13 to 15% range based on the improvements achieved over the previous year. Had the planners been forced to work with the 40% waste rates of 1943, the operation would have required substantially more shipping and longer preparation time, potentially delaying the entire campaign. The improvements in packaging and distribution that seemed like technical minutiae in laboratory reports and field memoranda translated directly into strategic capability. The lessons learned in the Pacific about packaging durability and rapid distribution influenced military logistics far beyond the Second World War. The recognition that supplies needed to survive, extended exposure to hostile environments without degradation, drove post-war research into more resilient materials and better preservation methods. The experiments with rapid distribution and minimized stockpiling in forward areas became foundational concepts in military logistics doctrine. The understanding that time itself was a form of waste, that supplies sitting in dumps were supplies at risk regardless of the quality of their packaging, influenced how the military thought about supply chains in subsequent conflicts. The Korean War, fought partly in tropical conditions and partly in Arctic cold, benefited from packaging innovations and distribution doctrines developed in response to the Pacific waste crisis. The individual quartermasters who implemented these changes in forward areas largely remain anonymous. Their names do not appear in histories of major battles. Staff Sergeant Robert Chen, standing in that supply dump on Guadalcanal in August 1943, was one of thousands of quartermaster personnel who confronted the waste crisis daily and developed practical solutions under field conditions. The thatched roof warehouses they built, the rapid distribution systems they improvised, the careful documentation of spoilage patterns they maintained, these were not celebrated achievements. They were simply part of the vast, unglamorous work of keeping an army fed across the largest ocean on Earth. Yet without their efforts, the celebrated victories of the island-hopping campaign would have been impossible. Armies do march on their stomachs, and in the Pacific, it was the quartermasters who ensured there was something in those stomachs besides hunger and frustration. The civilian side of the story carried its own costs and ironies. American families endured rationing throughout the war, carefully managing their red stamps for meat and blue stamps for canned goods. They were told these sacrifices were necessary to feed the troops overseas. And they were necessary, but for much of 1943, a substantial portion of what they sacrificed was rotting in Pacific supply, dumps thousands of miles from the nearest combat soldier. The system demanded sacrifice from the home front, while simultaneously wasting the fruits of that sacrifice through logistical inadequacy. When the improvements finally came, when waste rates fell to manageable levels, there was no public announcement, no celebration. The families back home continued their rationing, without knowing that the system had finally become efficient enough to translate their sacrifice into actual sustenance for soldiers in the field. This gap between sacrifice and effectiveness, invisible to those making the sacrifice, was one of the quiet tragedies of the war. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, the American logistics system in the Pacific had evolved into perhaps the most sophisticated military supply operation ever mounted. Waste rates had stabilized at levels comparable to European operations despite far more challenging conditions. The innovations in packaging and distribution, developed in response to the crisis, were now standard practice. Forward supply dumps used improved shelters and rapid distribution procedures as a matter of course. The system could sustain operations across the entire span of the Pacific, from the west coast to the shores of Japan itself, a distance that would have been unthinkable in 1943, when 40% of supplies were spoiling before they reached soldiers in the Solomons. Staff Sergeant Robert Chen, and the thousands of quartermasters like him, returned home when the war ended. Their service was recognized with the same campaign ribbons awarded to all veterans of the Pacific Theater, but there were no specific decorations for solving the waste crisis. The work they had done was too diffuse, too technical, too far removed from dramatic battlefield action to capture public imagination. Yet without that work, the battlefield victories that did capture public imagination would have been impossible. The marine assaults on Tarawa and Iwo Jima, the army campaigns in New Guinea and Luzon, the Navy's drive across the Central Pacific, all of these operations depended absolutely on a logistics system that could keep hundreds of thousands of men fed across thousands of miles of ocean. When that system was failing in 1943, wasting 40% of what it shipped, every operation was constrained by the inefficiency. When it worked in 1944 and 1945, wasting only 13%, operations could proceed at the tempo required for victory. The soldiers who benefited from the improved supply system mostly never knew there had been a crisis or that it had been solved. They received their rations, ate what they were given, and focused on the immediate demands of combat. If the quality and consistency of their food improved over the course of 1944, they likely attributed it to luck or to being in better supplied units, rather than to systematic improvements in packaging and distribution. The invisibility of successful logistics is perhaps its defining characteristic. When the system works, it disappears from consciousness. It is only failure that draws attention. The quartermasters who solved the Pacific waste crisis achieved the paradoxical success of making their achievement invisible. Looking back from the present day, the waste crisis of 1943 offers lessons that extend beyond military logistics. It demonstrates that the solution to scarcity is not always increased production. Sometimes the problem is delivery rather than supply. It shows that systems designed for one set of conditions can fail catastrophically when applied to different conditions, even when the underlying principles seem sound. It illustrates that adaptation requires not just technical innovation, but conceptual flexibility, the willingness to question foundational assumptions when evidence demonstrates they are inadequate, and it reveals that some of the most critical work in any large endeavor is unglamorous, technical, and easily overlooked, yet absolutely essential to overall success. The irony that opened this story remains its most powerful truth. American abundance nearly caused American starvation in the Pacific, not because there was too little food, but because there was too much waste. The richest nation on Earth, with the greatest industrial capacity ever assembled, could not keep its soldiers fed until it learned to stop wasting what it produced. The lesson applies far beyond warfare. Abundance without effective delivery is just another form of scarcity. Production without distribution is waste. And waste, no matter how wealthy the source, eventually constrains what can be achieved. The quartermasters of the Pacific learned that lesson the hard way, measuring it in tons of spoiled food and the diminished bodies of inadequately fed soldiers. Their adaptation, achieved under pressure and at great cost, made victory possible. That achievement deserves to be remembered, even if the men who accomplished it remain largely anonymous. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.